It's always uplifting to have young people join in an event like this, and it reminds me that even though we focus often on the things we're concerned about, things that might not be going well, I am so impressed with the leadership of many young people, and am convinced we're in awfully good hands, especially if we help move and nurture their development. One more round of applause for our young people. Thank you. Well, our next panel is an opportunity to introduce to you 4 great leaders in our state and in our community, all who care deeply about the lives of young children, especially those who are low income and have enormous challenges and barriers that they must fight through. And I'm going to introduce each of them briefly, and then also introduce and hand it over to our facilitator today. First on my lineup card is Joan Brandt. And Joan, you're going to have to wave because you're right in the middle, all right? All right, there you go. You all are just going to have to wave. Joan is the co-chair of the Minnesota Coalition for Targeted Home Visiting and Family Health Section Manager for the St. Paul Ramsey County Public Health. She has worked for over 30 years in nursing, most of the time in public health in a variety of settings, including Dakota County Public Health, Roseville Area Schools, and the North End South Como Block Nurse Program. So please welcome Joan, and we'll do it all at the end, but I'm glad you're here. Second is Barbara Milon. And Barbara is the executive director of the Phyllis Wheatley Community Center, where she oversees all aspects of its operation. Since its founding nearly a century ago, the Phyllis Wheatley Community Center has served over 200,000 children and families in North Minneapolis. Barbara is deeply engaged in the community, serving on numerous nonprofit and leadership boards. She is here today representing MinneMinds Coalition as a member of its executive committee. Peggy Flanagan has joined us, and Peggy is the executive director of the Children's Defense Fund in Minnesota and is an accomplished community and political organizer. As a citizen of the White Earth Nation, she has championed the rights of Native Americans and communities of color. Peggy also serves on Mayor Betsy Hodges' Cradle to K cabinet and serves on Governor Mark Dayton's Task Force for Child Protection. And finally, Liz Kuoppala. Liz is, we really worked on this, thanks. I did it wrong 8 times, I'm sure that was my 9th. But Liz is the executive director of the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless and has worked with the organization since 2001. She has served as the staffer to Senator Paul Wellstone and a city councilor in Eveleth, Minnesota. In particular, her efforts to recruit, train, and empower women from greater Minnesota to run for office has earned her numerous awards. So now we can welcome our 4 panel members. Our moderator today is Denise Johnson. Many of you probably know Denise. She serves as the editorial writer at the Star Tribune, where she has worked since 1996. Prior to joining the Star Tribune, Denise wrote for the Pioneer Press and Miami Herald. Denise is the ideal person to guide this conversation, as she has dedicated much of her writing to issues of educational disparities, helping to focus public opinion on this critical challenge in Minnesota and the country. Denise is the recipient of numerous journalism awards, including the prestigious Frank Premack Graven Award for her career contributions to public journalism. Please welcome Denise Johnson. Thank you. Yeah, we got it. You just do your work.
Thank you, Frank. Good morning, everyone. Very glad to be here and glad to see all of you here to talk about such and discuss and get ideas about such an important issue, many important issues. As a journalist, I've covered education for a number of years, many years. I'm not going to tell you how many. I started when I was 2. I'm a proud graduate of St. Paul Schools. This is the community I grew up in. My daughter went to St. Paul Schools as well. And I know that our school systems here in Minnesota have been able to do an outstanding job for many of our students. I also know that we're having major problems, and that's part of why we're all here, with some of the disparities that have emerged over time, and that we're not doing as good as we are, as good as Minnesotans are, at doing a fine job with many students. We're not doing the kind of job that we need to do with too many of our kids. Before I came, I was working on an editorial about the story that was out recently that Commissioner Casilius talked about earlier, and that is that we now have reached a point where 51% of all students in American schools are eligible for free and reduced lunch. And that has huge, huge implications for the kinds of things we're talking about here today, the policies, the practices, how the organizations that you all represent work together in order to do something about that. We've heard from our top leaders, the governor, and our children's cabinet, and from these wonderful students that are examples of what I was talking about earlier, and that is that we can and do a wonderful job with students. And now we're going to hear from these wonderful panelists who are on the front lines and have some very specific ideas, some takeaways for you all to get out either pens or iPads or whatever you need to do to support certain kinds of legislation that will close some of these huge learning disparities that we have and support families. And that's one of the most important things, to make sure that that happens. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to kind of hit the highlights of their legislative proposals. And as they are talking about them, they have graciously provided us with them. So you'll see lists of them. So they're not necessarily going to go through all of them, because we want to keep those comments relatively brief so we can talk about questions at the end. But you will be able to see what their comments or their legislative proposals are for this session. So with that, let's start with Joan. If you would please tell us what your organization, a little bit about what it does, and then what your legislative proposals are.
Sure, thank you. So the Minnesota Coalition for Targeted Home Visiting is a group of about 40 organizations, over 40 organizations. We continue to grow and welcome any organization that is providing home visiting, because we really are about promoting home visiting across the state of Minnesota. And as you can see from the slide, we're a group of both public and private providers, nonprofit as well as local public health, children's advocacy organizations, health plans, and then we have active state participation, particularly this Minnesota Department of Health has been actively at our table. We represent both evidence-based, federally recognized evidence-based models such as Nurse-Family Partnership, Healthy Families America, Early Head Start, Parents as Teachers, just to name a few, as well as agencies that are working outside of evidence-based models. So why home visiting? Why is it important? Well, we start early. We get in the homes prenatally for many of our organizations. We work 0 to 3 or even up to age 5, depending upon the organization that we represent. It's a strategy that really works within the context of the family and the community. We work to understand what the family's barriers are, and then promote work within family strengths to really move the family ahead and promote the parent-child interaction. We know that there's a return on investment. Some of the research indicates that with every dollar invested in family home visiting, there's a return of almost $6 in public programs such as public assistance, reduced child maltreatment, as well as in the criminal justice system on down the line. So it's significant in terms of the return on investment. We work with families only on a voluntary basis. We don't force ourselves into the home. We're not the nanny state whatsoever. We're there only if the family invites us to be there. We are truly guests in the family's home. We know that our outcomes have an impact on promoting brain development, parent-child interaction, healthy birth outcomes, school readiness, as I said earlier, reduced child maltreatment. For those kids who come to school where there are issues, hopefully we've worked early enough on to mitigate some of the issues that families deal with, living in poverty, domestic violence, those kinds of things. Our legislative agenda for this year is to maintain the current level of funding for family home visiting, as well as to support the development of a home visiting infrastructure around statewide training, data collection, and administration, and looking at the use of outcomes and standards, particularly for programs that aren't currently functioning under a federally recognized evidence-based model.
Thank you. Next, we will hear from Barbara.
Good morning. I am delighted to be here today, and I am the Executive Director at Phyllis Wheatley Community Center, and Frank has provided you information about Phyllis Wheatley Community Center. We also have the oldest licensed child development center in the state of Minnesota, the Mary T. Welcome Center. I want to talk to you about MinneMinds, and MinneMinds is a statewide coalition. It's supported by more than 90 organizations that represent philanthropy, businesses, community organizations, early education providers, and parents. MinneMinds is dedicated to pursuing public policy solutions that ensure Minnesota's most at-risk children have access to high-quality early learning and programs across the state. Over the past several years, MinneMinds has helped secure more than $45 million in funding for early learning scholarships. This has helped more than 5,000 children attend quality early learning programs across the state. Despite the progress, there are still too many of our children who aren't able to access the critical early education that they need in order for them to have a bright future. So this puts our children behind their wealthier peers before they even reach kindergarten, and that's bad for their future, and that is bad for our future. And it is bad for the prosperity of Minnesota, as you've heard from various speakers on this morning, including the governor of our state. So that's why this year at the Capitol, MinneMinds will again be pursuing an aggressive legislative agenda to secure more support for early learning scholarships. Early learning scholarships for the lowest income families are a unique funding stream providing flexible, parent-directed access to high-quality early learning and development programs that are focused on our children that need it the most. The funding follows the child, which means that if a family has to move, that the child still has that opportunity to have their support. And we know that by supporting early child development, we are looking at the social, cognitive, language, physical development of our children that supports their readiness for kindergarten. In addition to advocating for funding that will allow 20,000 at-risk children to have quality child development during the 2018-2019 biennium, MinneMinds will also be asking the legislature to remove the cap on scholarships so that children can fully access the programs that are best fit for their child. We want to see the legislature allow exceptionally high-risk children from ages who are infant children up to 2 years old to be able to have scholarships. Lastly, in support, we want a full spectrum of early education. We would like the legislature to make progress on quality standards for home visiting, and these standards will make it possible to empower the best home visiting for our families and children. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you. Next, we will hear from Peggy.
Good morning. My name, again, is Peggy Flanagan, and I'm really excited to be here, and I just want to say thank you especially to the fabulous table up front of young people for being here. I wanted to share with you a couple of pieces of our legislation. As many of you know, Children's Defense Fund Minnesota is a child advocacy organization that works to ensure that kids get a healthy start, a good start, a moral start in life, and really have a solid foundation to grow up to be strong young people who thrive, like the young people who spoke to us earlier today. So the things that we're looking at, I'll talk about two things. I could talk about a lot more, but I'll talk about two things. The first is ensuring affordable, accessible child care for all Minnesota families. The Child Care Assistance Program is really key and critical to ensuring that families can work, that parents can work, and that children are in supportive and nurturing care. This is something that is really close to my heart because I was a CCAP kid. My mom used the Child Care Assistance Program to get to work to ensure that she could provide for me, and I think I turned out okay. The sort of three pieces that we want to look at is, again, to fully fund the program to ensure that all eligible families can access it. Currently, we have a waiting list of 7,000 families in this state, and these are hard-working families who want to get to work, who want to be employed, and the astronomical cost of childcare is preventing them from doing so. So we're eager to work on that piece of the legislation. The second piece is to increase the state's reimbursement rate to providers to ensure that more kids can have access to CCAP, and that many of the folks who are providers are single women, frankly, who do this in their homes. And that also is a way to strengthen our economy and to ensure that provider rates take on more children who could access the CCAP program. And then the third piece of the solution is that we'll be supporting is an improvement in the child dependent care tax credit so that more low income and middle income families can afford the high cost of childcare. We really think that childcare is one of the most significant pieces of the puzzle to providing family economic security. The second piece that I will be talking about, clearly you can see we support a paid family leave insurance program, as well as improving the standards of care, building on what we did last year for the healthy babies of incarcerated mothers, which are often a group of folks who don't get the time and attention they need. But the second piece I want to focus on briefly is the Part C intervention services for families, which falls under the IDEA and is an effective program for infants and toddlers who have a developmental delay or have a physical or mental condition that is likely to result in a developmental delay. And the thing that we would like to do is expand the categorical eligibility of Part C to ensure that homeless families, homeless children, have access to this really important program. We think it's clear that there is a gap between the kids who receive services and the kids who are eligible for them. There's a recent report that was done through the Department of Education that I encourage all of you to geek out and to read that talks about just the need for homeless families. And we really believe that these early intervention services for children and their families that are often done in the home work in partnership with parents to ensure that they are learning how to best support and care for their child. So often, a lot of the intervention services that we see can feel punitive to families, and this will really feel empowering to families. And I think we're all about that. And believing that the more early intervention services that we give to children who are 0 to 2 and to their families, the more we can ensure that we decrease the children who are enrolled in special education in the long run. And knowing sort of the trauma that many of our homeless families and highly mobile families experience, the more support that we can give them to ensure the kids have a healthy start is something we're really excited about. And I could go on, but I won't. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. Liz?
Thanks. The Nigerian poet Chinua Achebe taught us that as long as one people sit on another and are deaf to their cry, so long will understanding and peace elude all of us. As long as one people sit on another and are deaf to their cry, so long will understanding and peace elude all of us. This is the spirit in which we do our work at the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless. We bring together grassroots and grasstops leaders from rural, urban, and suburban parts of our state. People who have experienced homelessness and people who have always been in the upper or middle class, but have an interest in making our state work for everyone. We are working to build our intercultural competence so we can better address the racism, sexism, and regionalism that create deep disparities and steal the ladder of opportunity from too many Minnesotans. We tackle homelessness from a couple of angles. One is addressing the shortage of housing and services. The other is addressing the income side. We know that of all of Minnesota's homeless population, half are children and youth. Let me repeat that. Half of Minnesota's homeless are children and youth. Last year, over 13,000 public school students were identified by school districts across the state as homeless or highly mobile. We know that when kids are stably housed, they do better at school. We know that when infants and toddlers are stably housed, they have much better chance at developing strong brains and healthy bodies. And we know that when children are housed, their families are less reliant on other social services, and that every dollar invested in supportive housing returns $1.44 to the state. We know that when youth transitioning to adulthood are housed, they can overcome enormous odds. In 2015, the Homes for All campaign is looking for $39 million. This would help prevent and end homelessness for 4,800 households. For the wonks among you, $19.5 million would go to DHS, the other $19.5 million to MHFA. If homelessness isn't your issue, there's just 3 words to remember as you're talking to legislators: homes for all. We need $39 million. We need your help to get this done. Secondly, we work to address the income side. Cash grants for families on public assistance have not been raised since 1986. Back then, the cash grant was large enough to pay the rent. But for the past 20 years, it hasn't been, and families are the fastest growing segment of the homeless population. And if you can't pay the rent, car repairs and gas are totally out of reach. Employers and employment service providers consistently list transportation issues as a barrier to hiring or promoting or maintaining their workforce. So the Prosperity for All campaign is seeking $100 a month increase to the cash grant for families on public assistance. And as you know, 70% of the people on public assistance are children. This is an investment in their ability to get to school or to childcare or to the dentist. You only need 2 words for this campaign: MFIP transportation, or tweet #ProsperMN. Find us, the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless, on Facebook, and we'll keep you posted on ways to help out. As long as one people sit on another and are deaf to their cry, so long will understanding and peace elude all of us. Thank you for being here or watching online. Thank you for your commitment to children and youth. Thank you for having me.
Thank you to all of our panel members, and we'll have a few questions that I'd like to ask each of you. One of them has to do with you've all identified some of the disparities in various areas, and we know, again, that we have a number of them here in Minnesota across all of these things: health, housing, education. How will the proposals that you are outlining have an impact on some of the racial and social economic disparities? And I will start with you, Barbara, if you'd answer that question.
Thank you, Denise. That is a very good question. It's a good question because we know that if children are not prepared to enter school, to go to school so that they are learning, so that they have the capability to read, this is going to influence the rest of their lives. They will have very limited, they'll have limited skills, they'll have limited opportunities. So what we are seeking to do is we want all of our children, and because we address our children who are low income and our children who are at very great risk, we want the state of Minnesota to support our kids. We know that if our kids are supported, that they are going to do well. The only other thing I would just say is that the percentages of children who don't have access to early child development are impacting our children who are children of color. So when the governor talked this morning about structural inequities, we see that by investing and supporting our children's success, we change the paradigm of inequities and we link and build equality for an opportunity for our children and their future.
Thank you. Joan?
I would say that within family home visiting, by working with the families to remove barriers and help them learn how to access systems, which is a lot of what we do as well, we are really addressing the disparities, economic, racial, educational as well. And I echo what Barbara said in terms of getting kids ready to learn earlier is certainly going to help the educational disparities.
I have another question for the two of you that has to do with coordinating these efforts. We have had a long list from all of you. We also heard from our young people about a variety of things. We know we have finite resources at the legislature. We know that you're going to hear that when you are putting those ideas forth. What are the best ways to coordinate the efforts and make sure that we're not being duplicative, that we're not tripping over one another, and then everybody gets a little tiny bit and nothing gets accomplished? What are some of the best ways to do that?
So I appreciate that question, especially as a recovering school board member for Minneapolis and sort of dealing with many of the decisions that sort of come from the top down. One of the things that I think, clearly this room speaks to the fact that we're all here because we care about kids and are engaged in building relationships with one another. I think that is key. The governor mentioned it. Frank Forsberg mentioned it, that it's clear that we're building connections, building relationships and trust with one another to ensure that we are working shoulder to shoulder. I think one of the things we need to really ensure that we do is within coalitions like MinneMinds, within coalitions like Kids Can't Wait, within the Minnesota Homeless Coalition, is to be really clear about what we're moving forward and how those things can interact together. So for example, with the Child Care Assistance Program, if that can be the foundation, we can have families have access to it, and then we layer early learning scholarships on top of CCAP, which ensures kids have care all day, and then they also have additional early learning opportunities, and being able to frame things and talk that way so that we're supporting one another and not cutting one another down. As an organizer deep in my guts, right, that piece of trust and relationships that, we know that folks in power are going to search for those spaces and those places where we are disconnected and sort of go, try to erode some of those relationships. And I think based on this room and based on the fact that we need to build power, especially for those folks living in poverty, that's how we do it. And we're honest and we're open and we really build these connections and relationships with each other. And then the last thing I say, because I do want to touch briefly on the disparity piece, is to ensure that folks of color and American Indians are at the table when decisions are being made. We often ask folks to join on, to sign on. We do this also with young people after the biggest decisions have been made. Let's build relationships directly with folks of color and American Indians and with young people and with folks from the LGBTQ community to ensure that the policies that we are advocating for will actually make a difference in real people's lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. Liz?
I think, too, when we focus on our vision of what we want and less on programs, we have a lot better success. The Homes for All campaign formed, this is our 4th year now, so 4 or 5 years ago, we recognized that we were having no success or very little success at the legislature when housing developers would say, like, we need to develop housing, put all of our money there, and homeless services advocates would say, no, that takes 3 years to build something. Our need is urgent right now. We need to invest here right now. 4 years ago, we said, what if we do a both and? What if we develop, work with communities to imagine what kind of housing we want and work with families to figure out what kind of services we need to keep people stably housed. And when we've been able to do that, when we come together around a common vision in shaping our proposals, over the past 3 years, we've increased funding by $170 million, making significant investments. Last night was the point-in-time count for the homeless census across the state. And so we're interested to see these numbers as they come out on where we're making a lot of progress and where we still have some room to go. But I think when we focus on what's our goal, what's our vision. I think all of us have a very similar vision to the vision the youth express for the Minnesota they want. We all want. Thank you.
Thanks. We're hearing a lot from this particular legislature about Greater Minnesota, and I'm wondering if you can talk about the geographic needs and the impact of what you're suggesting for areas outside of the metro. And let's start with you, Joan.
We know that it's inadequate across the state, urban, suburban, and rural, but increasingly, the groups that I serve on, I hear about the disparities between the urban and rural communities outstate Minnesota. And the resources in outstate Minnesota are significantly less than those of us in the urban area. There are multiple home visiting agencies across the metro area. Outstate Minnesota, that's not true, and oftentimes it's local public health or the school district that's providing the home visiting services, and it may be 1 or 2 home visitors for a very large geographic district. So our push is really to increase the access across the state.
Peggy?
So we're Children's Defense Fund Minnesota, not Children's Defense Fund Twin Cities. So we pay attention as well to Greater Minnesota. And I think for both of the sort of issues that we're looking at with the Child Care Assistance Program and Part C intervention, there are not enough services for families in Greater Minnesota. And when we look at child care, I think several months ago there was an article that talked about some families who need to drive sometimes 45 minutes to an hour and a half to get child care for their children on top of working. I don't know about you, but that time in the car, now that I'm a mom, is maddening because I want to be at home playing with my kiddo, right? And so the more that we can expand opportunities and within the Child Care Assistance Program and make child care more accessible, the entire state benefits, and it's critical to have the Greater Minnesota voice within the fold. As someone who is also from the White Earth Nation, I know some of the challenges that are posed also for folks in Greater Minnesota and in Indian Country. And then with Part C, because these services are delivered through the school district, that, I think is something that should be encouraging to all of us, that is local, it's in the community, and oftentimes school districts are the places that folks know and trust. So we think that both of these particular policies, speak directly to the issues both in the urban core and in Greater Minnesota.
Liz?
I live in Moorhead, and I grew up on the Iron Range, and so I, every day, I guess, think about Greater Minnesota, and so many of our partners with the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless are working in Greater Minnesota. It really resonated with me when Commissioner Jessen said, she really understands the challenges as people have to drive so far to services. So we work to develop policies that will work for each community in the way the community wants it to work. And so we know, for example, that 1/3 of the homeless we can find, we know they're harder to find in Greater Minnesota, partly because there's not the resources available to hire outreach workers to find them. But of the homeless we identify, 1/3 are in Greater Minnesota, and we're certainly looking to get housing resources and services really in a way that works in those Greater Minnesota communities, as well as the metro and suburban areas. We certainly have gaps here as well.
Well, if we were to look at all the proposals that we've seen up on our screen, add that up, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. And I'm wondering from you, what are the things or the proposals, other proposals you're really excited about at the legislature? And how else can the legislature improve support for the various organizations you represent through policy changes? What kinds of policy changes might be most helpful? And this is over and above, outside of additional dollars. And I know that additional dollars are important. That's very important. But what other things are there that they might do?
I can start best this way, if that's okay. One of the challenges we have with developing housing is the legislature wants big numbers, obviously, for the numbers of units we're developing. It makes them very happy to see real big numbers, and so makes us all happy. But when you have a limited pot of money, it's cheaper to build housing for single adults than it is for families. And so I think if the legislature could work to accept that it's going to cost a little bit more in the short term to build units for families, but in the long term, when we look decades ahead, it's going to return a lot more to the state. So I think that would be one policy idea that wouldn't cost additional money.
One policy recommendation I would like to see happen, we mentioned that the governor approved $43 million last year to support scholarships. We need the businesses to also come to the table. Why not leverage this great resource that we've already committed and that we are seeking to get additional resources to support? I think the other thing that can happen is we need to continuously educate the community about the need for quality early child development and what that means in terms of the brain, the neurological development, the social development, the educational development, and how by supporting our children that we are supporting the workforce of tomorrow. And as it's been demonstrated by our young people, you did such a tremendous job. This is what we want to see happen for all of our children. And as long as we have some children, children of color who do not have quality child development, then that is a disservice for the whole entire community. It crosses sectors, it crosses social and economic demographics. This is something that we all have to buy into, and we have to understand that our children definitely are our future, and we want a future, so we have to be concerned about their education and their readiness for school and for learning.
Joan?
I don't think there's a policy that's been suggested this morning that we couldn't support because it would benefit the families that we serve through home visiting. But I also, in response to your second question, advancing outcomes and standards across the state of Minnesota for home visiting would certainly increase the quality and access for all families across the state.
Peggy, I'll let you have the last word here on this because we're at the end of our time.
So I think there's a couple of things, again, changing the eligibility for Part C, and could talk specifically about some programs. I think some of the, many of the recommendations that are coming down from the Task Force on Child Protection are policy changes and not necessarily big money items. But I wanted to say broadly what the legislature and the governor can do is to work across the aisle with one another on behalf of kids. I think too often we get caught up in political parties and affiliation, and that if we sort of keep our eyes on children over politics, that will, I'm going to paraphrase right from this young man who referenced Paul Wellstone, that we all do better when we all do better.
Thank you, Peggy. And thank all of you for your comments. And now you have a long list of things that you can go forward to try to support with our legislature. Please join me in thanking our panelists.